Welcome to the Roniel and DaRon podcast show. I'm DaRon.
And I'm Roniel. Why is penetration testing now considered more of a consulting wave, like in contracting? It moved over to being consultants instead of being a penetration tester. Why did it go that route? And what are your thoughts about it being moving away from penetration tester, the name itself, to a consulting or contracting base?
I think a lot of that really comes down to the big lie. In this case, I'm talking specifically about Ronald Reagan's lie that contracting was cheaper than doing it in-house. I mean, it doesn't take an accountant to realize if that were the case, then we would be in a very different world right now. But what wound up happening is the government went heavy on contracting because Reagan pushed it hard, using it supposedly as a means to reduce costs. But the premise goes like this. If I hire a contractor or a consultant, then I don't have to pay for their insurance, and I don't have to pay for things like their benefits, so 401ks, especially, so retirement, right?
Yeah.
Way back when, the government was on a real pension. It's not on a real pension anymore. Their current system is really just a glorified 401k. And that's even for the military now, which is a travesty. To me, if you're going to go through and ruin your body and risk getting killed, I mean, the reward, because the pay is terrible, so the reward should be a little better than it is. but what winds up happening is, of course, if I have a contractor, I am paying their salary, plus I'm paying overhead. Now that whole overhead is going to be their HR, their IT staff, whatever it costs that company for, licensing for, say, Microsoft Office, and for the computer and all this other stuff that the person is using. So that starts adding to the cost of this individual contractor. And then, of course, we have to pay for all the management, including vice presidents and presidents and all that good stuff. So that, again, increases that overall cost. Now, here's the other kicker. If I have you as a consultant or a contractor 100% of the time, then I am going to be paying for your life insurance. I am going to be paying for your 401k. I am going to be paying for all your different, your medical insurance and any other benefits that the company is actually offering you, I'm paying for. So not only am I paying for all the things that I would have to pay for you, but I'm also paying an overhead cost for all of your management who's not on my contract, and for HR, your HR who's not on my contract, and your IT who's also not on my contract. So we have this thing where we talk about paying in bulk. Paying in bulk is supposedly cheaper, right? So rather than buying one roll of tissue paper, I buy 10 rolls. Or if I'm at Costco, I'm buying 100 million rolls.
Right.
And I pay less per roll. Well, if that logic holds true, it would make sense that if I am hiring individuals and my HR can, say, do 500 individuals within a company in general, one HR person to 500. That's actually, it's probably a bit high. We'll say 100 personnel per HR individual. Then if I mostly stack with, say, small businesses are going to be less than 400 people. So that means that I'm actually not doing myself a favor, because I have all these fees and they tack fees on top of it. So it's not just overhead and all this other stuff, they make you pay fees. So point in all of that being, that contractors are significantly more expensive when you actually do the math. But here's the big joke to the whole thing. What you can do as the government is say, I've reduced the number of employees. And instead, what you've done is you've shifted them over to contractors and consultants, right? And you're paying more for them, especially in the now. And you would say, well, not in the long term, not in the long term. Well, you're making a lot of assumptions about these contractor staff. Most contractor staff stay within that organization. They're what's called on-site, and they stay within that organization for their whole careers. So you are paying for their pension, for their 401k, for all their health insurance, and you're also paying for that of all of that company's folks, their IT, so on and so forth. Now, what came of all of this is a big industry grew throughout the government. And then this industry started spilling over into the corporate world because companies started doing this insane thing of saying, okay, well, I'm going to stick with what I'm good at and I'm going to contract everything else out. Now, here's the kicker. Contracting and consulting is cheaper if it's something that rarely occurs. If it's something you don't do with any regularity, any frequency. You don't sit there and build houses, right? You don't build your house and all this other stuff with any regularity. So it would be cheaper for you to go through and get a contractor for those few times where you have to do it. But at some point, if your entire staff or a large portion of your staff is contractor or consultant based, then you're losing out on a lot of money. But there was this big trend of, well, as a company, you need to slim down, cut down, and then just contract out anything that's not part of, your day-to-day work. And actually, I heard an interview recently by the guy who really pushed and started that trend within the corporate world. And he was decrying the fact that companies are even contracting out what they do on a day-to-day basis. They're even contracting out their main business to other organizations, which would be ironic. That would be like your company or my company going through and contracting out security, cybersecurity. It doesn't make any sense. But what's happened is because the contractor world started pulling in so much money through all this overhead and all this other stuff, there became a prestige thing. And so your penetration testers, in order to garner more money, because if we're honest here, security in general, the pay is going through the roof because it is so understaffed. And thanks to COVID, companies have finally been forced to invest in their information technology, to invest in their information systems, I should say. So all of their IT assets, which is something they weren't doing before. Before, they were pushing a lot of it off, and you'd get these really ancient just networks that were shoestring and bubble gum all over the place, right? And so COVID forced them to invest in it because no one could get into their virtual work because they didn't have a proper VPN. They didn't have proper firewalls. And then everyone starts getting compromised because, of course, they opened everything up inappropriately in order to allow virtual work. And now all of a sudden, people like you and I are in even further demand than we were before. So, but that's why you saw this title change. It was mostly glory hound and trying to pull more money. And it's all thanks to my industry, which is all thanks to Ronald Reagan and his lies.
Yeah, I found that very interesting because, back in, I want to say, let's say just roughly around the 2000s, you've seen this. I'm not saying it didn't happen before then, but around the 2000 area is when I remember like penetration testing booming, like it's just blowing up. It's a really, really big thing. The name itself, ethical hacker, all of those things were just the name to be. But then you kind of started to see the shift over the recent years where it's not penetration tester anymore. I mean, it's not even on the name. Like,
Yeah.
if you see some of these companies when they present their employees, you don't see penetration tester. You see security consultant or senior security consultant, or you see contractor as their title.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to me because I really wanted to understand why that changed and where it changed from. Like, where did it come from? Like, what was the use of the change? But as you said, that makes more sense on why things have changed. So,
well, and another interesting part to it, as you know, is they're doing less and less actual penetration tests, right?
yeah. I mean, let's think about it. A reference from, forgot, what is it? Live Overflow. Remember we were looking at that video where there was a comparison from penetration testing over in the US and penetration testing over in the UK. And it's a lot different from here and there. And even then, both of them to me doesn't seem like they're really doing majority of penetration testing, even from an AppSec perspective. You not utilizing certain things, do you really call it penetration testing?
Right.
Is it really, like, are you really giving your client the benefit of an actual test instead of running a vulnerability scan or just doing regular code reviews? Not saying that you can't find any bugs, but we're talking about a whole attack surface area that you should be targeting. So that's an interesting thing to see how things are different and how they evolved from actually doing testing, even though there were still people using tools, to not really actually doing penetration testing and more of an assessment.
Yeah, that slow and steady, well, actually, I guess it's rather rapid switch. Well, and a lot of that switch, I would argue, is because, and almost solely because, the lack of qualified personnel. It's much easier to hire someone who can just run a tool and do an assessment than it is to hire people who can do real, no kidding penetration tests, real no kidding engagements, period. And that's even more true in the application security world, where, I mean, you really want to talk about a dearth of professionals. It's in the application security world. Booz Allen, when I was there, had approximately 20,000 people, and I was the only one who did application security. Out of 20,000, and they're the premier, and were the premier organization for cybersecurity for the federal government. And today, of course, they own 90% of all federal cybersecurity work. And they don't and can't really do true application security because they don't have the personnel for it. The DoD went through and for years has been trying to get their contractors to shore up their security, because a lot of the penetrations that are occurring, a lot of the incursions that are occurring right now in the DoD are coming through two major sources: civilian government agencies, and then, of course, DoD partners, but also through things like contractors. So I don't need to break into the, U.S. Missile Defense Agency. I just need to break into unicorn company here that happens to be a contractor on that. So the DoD went through and they pushed out these new standards, CMMC. And when they pushed those out, I sat there and said, those won't stand, such as they were. And I stand by that. And it's been proven, because now the Senate is demanding that the DoD revise it, heavily revise it. The reason being, small businesses simply can't afford it. Now, here's one of the big jokes about contracting is, for years, it was just a few major companies making huge amounts of money. But the federal government started pushing hard, saying, you, different agencies, have to award contracts to so many small businesses and disadvantaged businesses, woman-owned, hub-zone, veteran-owned, disabled veterans, so on and so forth, right? Those small organizations don't have what it takes to meet CMMC. Now, CMMC goes through and it's supposed to have your network and all your equipment as a contractor secured, and it gets audited and all this other stuff. But the issue there is, number one, the program is not properly in place. They don't have a good, solid on-ramp for auditors. So how you even get an auditor is still incredibly up in the air. How much auditors make you pay. And then who pays it? Well, the answer, of course, is the contract company, right? Well, if an audit costs you $100,000, can you, as a small business who's just trying to start up, afford that? No. Not even close. And the other thing about government contracting is it typically takes around 6 months before you see a penny of what you're owed. And, after the first 6 months, it starts, yeah, it's surprising, huh?
Yeah, that's crazy.
So now you're saying these small businesses have to float for both 6 months, but also they have to float $100,000 or more to have their audit. Well, the DoD sat there and they're like, well, but they should have been charging us for this audit that they're having. Okay, yes, we could argue that they should build that into their pricing, but most companies aren't, because what it comes down to so oftentimes is lowest bidder. So if I build that pricing in, then I cost more than you. You didn't build the pricing in because you're a bigger small business or a bigger company, period. So you just ate the cost. You're like, well, 100,000, that's nothing. But also, how does a small business afford people like you and I? They can't, right?
No.
And they can't afford good IT staff either. In fact, a lot of small businesses have no real IT staff, or they contract it out. So they're definitely not getting what they need to have. And the truth is, what the government needs to do is stop contracting with these small businesses. Let me rephrase that because people will misunderstand. What the government needs to do is stop having small businesses and contractors, period, have DoD data on contractor systems. If the DoD really wants to take its security seriously, make contractors use DoD systems. Then contractors don't need to have this audit because DoD data never enters the contractor system. Problem solved. And some people might say that sounds too easy, but it is that easy. The only thing the contractor would deal with is invoicing. And at that point, the contractor's just dealing with invoicing how many people are on it. All of the IT is the government's. It's owned by the government, it's managed by the government, it's operated by the government, and or its contract staff, so on and so forth. But since the government has complete control, the government is the one auditing, and all prices, therefore, all costs are incurred by the government. Problem solved, and all of this goes away. Then you don't need CMMC. Then you don't need this complex audit structure and all of this other craziness. And everyone's happy. The government saves a boatload of money and is more secure at the same time. It's that simple. But here's the problem with the big lie. The big lie was that contractors saved money. So to the government, bringing it back in-house is going to cost money. But it won't. Because you, the Roniel startup, is supposedly charging them, that's right, supposedly charging them for that audit. So they're paying for the audit either way. What did they save? Well, they saved in the IT staff to manage it. No, they didn't, because they still paid for it. They paid for it in overhead. They also paid for HR, and they paid for expensive presidents, CEOs, CFOs, and all this other stuff. Not just for one small business, but for a whole bunch of small businesses. And if you've ever been in a small business, I'm going to tell you this, almost all of them, the owners use the business like a cash register.
Yeah, I can agree with that. This is our segment for today. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. And I am Roniel.
I am DaRon.
And thank you for watching this episode of the Roniel and DaRon podcast show. We'll see you on the next episode.
Have fun.